Welcome to Marquis Monday, a 6-month Lafayette 200 Bicentennial series featuring authors who have written books related to the Marquis de Lafayette. I am Kathleen, your host this evening. During our program, we invite you to submit any questions you might have by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits. Tonight, American Sign Language interpretation is also available by activating the interpretation button in the same location. When a young Frenchman sailed across the Atlantic to America in 1777 to fight in the Revolutionary War, little did he know that he would develop a close relationship with George Washington that would last a lifetime. Tonight's featured author, Jeff Finegan, will help us understand the extraordinary relationship between George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. A collector of George Washington manuscripts, as well as other important early American documents, Mr. Finegan has garnered a distinguished reputation as a speaker on the topic of the nation's first president through his I Knew George Washington book series. Intended for a younger audience, the majority of readers are adults who enjoy the unique perspective from which the stories are told. Jeff's lectures and book signings include such important historic destinations as Mount Vernon, Colonial Williamsburg, Valley Forge, Morristown, National Historic Park, Washington Crossing, Old Sweets Church in Philadelphia, and tonight our February 17th Marquis Monday webinar. Welcome, Jeff.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. So we'll give a little background on the slides that kind of walk us through the story. So the logo for the I Knew George Washington series, which my artist and I conceived when we were working on the Lafayette and Washington book, which was the third in our series. And we thought it would be nice to have some sort of branding. So this is what my artist, Preston Hindmarch, formerly of Easton, PA, now residing in Florida, came up with. You see the little wax seal with the GW. The GW actually is a cipher that Washington drew himself. It was to be painted on carriage doors. Now, whether he actually did that or not, I don't know. But we thought we'd borrow his artwork and include that in the design. And we actually have little wax seals reproduced that we put on book cards for those that purchase the books. We like to hand those out. The key to the Bastille, we start out at the beginning of the book with a nice paragraph making the claim that if there's an object that we could point to bring the two men together in the form of an object, it is in fact the key to the Bastille. So real quick, Lafayette was given the task of demolishing the prison in Paris, and he extracts the key to the front door and sends it off to Washington with a great letter in which he refers to Washington as the patriarch of liberty. This key hangs at Mount Vernon in the exact spot that Washington placed it in when he returned to Mount Vernon in his retirement from the presidency in March of 1797. It hung at the presidential mansion in New York for a short while. Then for all 7 years, the balance of Washington's presidency in the city of Philadelphia, and then made the trip home to Mount Vernon, where you can see it there today. It's quite an object. Mount Vernon in its original state. So we'll remember, or I should say, we should remind the folks that are weighing in tonight, even though it's Marquis Monday, this is more of a story on Washington, but seen through the Marquis's eyes. So our book series is historic fiction, 4 separate stories, all told from the perspective of people that knew Washington very well. What is also interesting is those 4 people all knew each other very well. So again, a reminder that this is not just about the Marquis, but the Marquis, from his unique perspective, tells us the story. Back to the slide. Mount Vernon, as Washington knew it as a young man, probably built by his father, story and a half farmhouse. Washington in the late 1750s, about the time of his marriage, would raise that house up a full story, right at the outset of the American Revolution, and construction not concluded until after the Revolution. He puts on his office and bed suite on the south section of the house, north section, that large dining room. If you've ever gone through Mount Vernon, it's usually the room that you go through first on the tour. It's now closed for restoration. The cupola and the pediment would come about 1786, 1787, somewhere in that area. And that gives us the look of the house that Washington knew later in his life and that we see today when we visit there. The Exchange Building in Charleston, South Carolina, still there today. So you'll see a lot of architecture in our books, which I happen to love, historic architecture. And these are places that are mainly original buildings. We offer some images of rebuilt buildings, but we try to stick with original. So the reader, young or old, can visit and bring the story to life by visiting these places. So when Lafayette arrives early in July of 1777, he lands in Georgetown, South Carolina, not Charleston. He lands in Georgetown. Now, although his quest is to get to Philadelphia as soon as possible, the fathers in South Carolina quickly whisk him south, not in the direction that he wanted to go, but south to Charleston to see the beautiful city that they have there. So before Lafayette arrives, there's word that he's on his way. And he's extremely wealthy. He's very well connected to the court at Versailles. So he is a celebrity before he even hits the shores. So rather than go north directly to Philadelphia, he spend some time in Charleston. This building, still there today. Ultimately, when Washington as president goes on his tour of the southern states in his second term, he would actually be entertained in this building to have a large candlelit dinner for him in the city of Charleston. The City Tavern in the city of Philadelphia, a rebuilt building there today, a rebuilt building faithfully redone as a result of plenty of 18th century images of the building remaining. So the Park Service, I think in the 1950s, rebuilds it. It was a viable restaurant up until the time of the pandemic. I'm not too sure what's happening there now. Now, a little bit of controversy here too, and I think I'm on the right side of the research that we did. There's varying claims. I did a talk on my books just a couple of days ago, and I was challenged by an individual. So we make the claim that Washington and Lafayette meet in this building on July 31st of 1777. It's a big day for Lafayette. He's given a volunteer major general's commission by Congress earlier in the day. And from what our research tells us, he meets Washington. The reason that he's crossed the Atlantic, the reason that he's traveled over dusty and muddy roads from South Carolina to the city of Philadelphia, to enter a room and see a man standing in the room in a splendidly attired general's uniform, on average 6 inches taller than every other man in the room. And Lafayette is able to meet Washington for the first time. There's references out there to Lafayette and Washington not meeting until the 5th of August at the Mullen House, which is in, I think, Warminster Township, outside of Philadelphia. It's a great historic building if anyone in the area has the opportunity to visit. Research telling us that's where Lafayette meets, I should say, joins the army for the first time, August 5th, at the Mullen House, not meeting Washington for the first time. There is a very prominent Washington website, I won't mention them by name, that's got that data that they meet for the first time on the 5th. But again, from what my research tells me, they're meeting here on the 31st of July, 1777. Kath? The Gideon Gilpin House on the battlefield, or the Brandywine battlefield, the first battle that Lafayette is in. There's a little bit of, I wouldn't say controversy, but this is thought to be headquarters. Although I've seen someone challenge the fact that Lafayette didn't necessarily have his own command at this point, so it wouldn't necessarily be his headquarters, but thought to have stayed there. He's going to be quartered somewhere on his return, of which we're celebrating the 200th anniversary. It's alleged that he would revisit the house and find an aging and ailing Gideon Gilpin still in the house, and the two have a tearful reunion. Gilpin would pass shortly thereafter. A great image of the Marquis de Lafayette, and if you can see that long name that he's got there, Washington would normally refer to him as Gilbert, or my dear Marquis. Lafayette is wearing the Continental Army uniform, and interestingly, if you can get a close enough look or find the image when we're done here, he is wearing the Society of the Cincinnati Eagle on the lapel. It was at the only time the only foreign decoration that French officers, and of course you had to be an officer to be in the Society of Cincinnati, the only American decoration or foreign decoration that French officers could wear upon the return to France. Lafayette went to Louis XVI and got permission for them to wear that. So that's an incredible image of Lafayette. He was losing his hair at a young age, so I think we're going to see an image as we go forward. So take note of Lafayette with a beautiful wig on in this image. Again, we're back to our historic architecture. So Lafayette is with Washington at Brandywine, and they hear of action on the right side of the battlefield, the right flank. Washington is more towards the left. Lafayette wants nothing more than to enter battle for the first time, even though he's got some military training in France. He's never heard a shot fired in anger, as the old expression goes. With Washington's blessing and to be cautious, Lafayette makes his way to where the action is. He's only there for a short time, as the story has it. He dismounts to hold retreating troops, and he receives a ball through the calf of his leg. He's taken to this building in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the Sun Inn. It's actually built for non-Moravian, Bethlehem being founded by Moravians. It's actually a place for non-Moravians to stay while they're visiting. It's now a Continental hospital. Lafayette's only in the building for a short period of time when those that are operating the hospital realize that he's got not only military rank, but he's got social rank as well. So he's only in this loud, smoky public building for a short period, and he's whisked out of there and held privately with a family that lives right down the street. He writes an absolutely incredible letter from this building to his wife, who is in Paris. So if you think of those two worlds kind of coming together, this tiny little Moravian village in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, his wife in Paris, he writes about these very gentle Eastern Europeans, the Moravians, that are taking such great care of him. And for the first time, his wife, my dear heart, Adrienne, as he would refer to her, reads about what an incredible individual George Washington is, all from the city of Bethlehem, the town of Bethlehem at that point. Gath, we're good? So the more celebrated of Washington's winter encampment headquarters, the Isaac Potts house at what was known then as the Valley Forge. We included Washington's personal flag in the right-hand image. Washington's there. His flag's going to be flying out. It's in this building that Dr. James Craik, who actually tells our second story, "'Tis Well, the Life and Death of George Washington," his good friend and battlefield surgeon from the French and Indian War, joins Washington in 1754. Craik hears of a cabal to replace Washington, known as the Conway Cabal, to replace Washington as the commander in chief of the Continental Army. He storms through the front door. He enters Washington's office. They've been great friends for many years. Craik is a surgeon in the Continental Army. And Craik breaks the news to Washington that he's about to be overthrown by his own men, both in the military and most likely in Congress also. Upon hearing this, as word spreads about the camp, Lafayette leaves his headquarters and makes his way as quickly as possible. When he gets to the Isaac Potts house, he's informed that the boss is busy and he doesn't have the time to see him. Fortunately for us, Lafayette is not allowed in to see the boss. Why are we so fortunate? Because he goes back to his headquarters and he writes an absolutely incredible letter to Washington. "I am now sworn to your fate and will defend it with the sword and or any other means available to me." He's writing in English, which he studied on the ship on the way over. It's not so good. There's a lot crossed out. We actually use an image of that letter in this book, and it's on loan from Lafayette College. Lafayette College owns many letters that Lafayette wrote to Washington. They have an incredible collection, and this is one of those letters. And it's in this house where Washington would open this letter. If I'm not mistaken, Washington dockets the receipt of the letter December 31st of 1777. So it's right the last day of the year and in the early part of the Valley Forge encampment. Kath, we're doing good here. This is an interesting story. This is the first look that Europe would have of George Washington. So the story, the artist is La Payon. It's an engraving of a painting that La Payon did. Most likely the servant taking care of Washington's horse in the background is Billy Lee. He's a slave valet who spends every waking moment of all 8 years of the American Revolution together. Billy actually began the I Knew George Washington series by telling us the story of he and Washington fighting in the Revolution together and what it's like to be enslaved by the individual that Lafayette would refer to as the Patriarch of Liberty. When Lafayette is ready to set sail out of Boston to head back to France on his first trip back after he makes his trip to North America, he writes Washington a letter and he says, "You know, the folks in Europe don't have any idea what you look like. Is there any chance that I can get a painting of you to take with me?" And Washington writes back. He says, "Oh, you missed a golden opportunity. Charles Wilson Peel was here in camp with us, and he could have done a real quick image for you to bring back. But while you're in Boston, John Hancock has a painting of me at his residence in Boston that Peel did. Why don't you see if he'll lend that to you?" So Lafayette approaches Hancock. "By all means, take it with you." It goes back to France. La Payon sees that painting and does a couple of different paintings of Washington, of which this, I think, is the most incredible. It shows Washington in his Continental Army uniform in all of his greatness. So for the first time, Europe would get a look at Washington. Previous to this, with Washington's fame as early as 1775, the outset of the American Revolution, there are plenty of image sellers in Europe that are just doing a male figure with a Continental Army uniform, looks nothing like Washington, and they just put George Washington across the bottom of it, and they sell them like crazy. But in this case, this is Europe's first look at George Washington. Yeah. So we talked about Lafayette in his image, and that the previous image of Lafayette was an engraving done of a painting that was done, I believe, in 1789 by a French artist. Here, what we did was we had a little fun with this. In 1779, George Washington hires Charles Willson Peale, previously mentioned, to do and we don't know why, and I haven't found it anywhere, but Peale does a wigless portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette. He's a young man, but he's going bald. Nevertheless, this painting hangs at Mount Vernon. It's about a 3/4 of Lafayette, and it hangs in the Lafayette bedroom, often called the Lafayette bedroom. When Lafayette comes back in his 1784 visit, would be his third trip to North America. He would write a letter to his wife back in France, and he'd say, I've got a great bedroom with 2 windows that face the Potomac. There's only one bedroom at Mount Vernon that can make that claim. So they know exactly the room that he stayed in. But we thought we'd have a little fun with this. So as the viewer, you just walked in on Charles Willson Peale as he is executing that 1779 wigless portrait of Lafayette. Just a footnote, Peale is often synonymous with the city of Philadelphia, where he had his famous museum and where his sons, who became equally famous artists, did a lot of their work, and Peale as well. But he's originally from Chestertown, Maryland, where his father worked as a saddle maker. He started as a young man as an artist, and Martha in 1772 has heard of him and hires him to come to Mount Vernon to execute the first painting that George Washington ever sat for. Washington would sit for about 18 different artists, but Peale would paint him from life more than anyone. Washington obviously feels strongly about his artwork and again hires him to do this image of Lafayette. Yeah. The very ornate palace at Versailles. And we not only do we have Versailles in the background there, but we pulled out an image of one of the carriages used by Louis XVI and included that in there. So Lafayette, as most of our Lafayette enthusiasts know, is extremely wealthy through inheritance, and it would be extremely important to the American Revolution when he goes back to France after his first visit. He'd be in France for about a year, and it's that direct contact that he has with the court at Versailles that allows him to, and the Comte de Vergennes and Louis XVI, to kind of come together and devise the plan that would be the beginning of the end of the American Revolution. Interesting to note that Lafayette sought permission from Louis XVI to come here and fight at Washington's side, and Louis told him no, he was not allowed to come here. Tell a 19-year-old with a lot of money what he can't do, and you've virtually assured that he's going to do it. Of course, we know that he makes his way to the coast, buys his own ship, names it La Victory, and sails into Georgetown, South Carolina, as we touched on earlier. It's that direct connection that he's got at the court of Louis XVI, again, that allows him to get that help that the American cause in Washington needs. But when he returns to France for the first time, Louis is unhappy because he did not listen to his king, and I believe he is put under house arrest for maybe 5 days. I think he stays at his father-in-law's residence in the city of Paris, and when that's concluded, then he is summoned to Versailles to sit down with the king and Vergennes and talk about the best way to win this war. Catherine, we're running out of time quick here. We got a lot to talk about. So the famous Hermione to deliver the news to Washington that men, money, and material will be coming to help him. He's put on this relatively new frigate, and they actually do engage a British warship on the way over. So when I had my artist do this, we have I think it's a 34 gun frigate, and in this image, the frigates actually open fire on the British. So Lafayette is a witness to naval battle as well. So the entire inspiration for this book was a letter that we acquired for our documents collection. At Yorktown, Lafayette goes to Washington and says, "I've got a wife and small children back in France. I need to get back. If, in fact, you win this war, I will be back to visit you." In August of 1784, Lafayette lands in New York and immediately writes Washington a letter that he's here. He's en route to Mount Vernon, but it might take a little bit. Washington's records don't indicate with any certainty whether he actually received that letter or not. But when Lafayette gets to Philadelphia en route to Mount Vernon, he writes him a second letter. We are fortunate to have that letter in our collection. In that letter, he refers to Washington as "my dear general," maybe 7 or 8 times. Thus, not only the inspiration for the book, but the inspiration for the title of the book as well. We know for a fact that Washington received that because on the address leaf, Lafayette writes, "General Washington, Mount Vernon, Virginia." And when Washington receives that letter and reads it, in the upper corner of that address leaf, Washington dockets it, "Received from the Marquis de Lafayette, August 1784. This is the cover image of the book, and this is Lafayette arriving to embrace Washington one more time, August of 1784. So back to our architecture, we start to get into who Washington is. This is Trinity Church in the city of New York. If I'm not mistaken, Alexander Hamilton is buried in the churchyard. But when Washington's inaugurated in April of 1789, immediately following the inauguration, he and Congress would walk from Federal Hall, where he was inaugurated, to Trinity, and they would pray not only for themselves and guidance in the new government, but for the new nation itself. Gadsby's Tavern, still there today, great place. City of Alexandria, Washington's birthday parties were held. He's a celebrity. He's world famous. Some historians make the claim that he's the most famous man in the world. So what do? We want to celebrate his birthday. Alexandria by horse is about 2 hours. Carriage probably a little bit quicker. But it's in this building that Washington holds at least a couple of his birthday parties. Lafayette would also be entertained in this building when he returns on his anniversary trip. The 50th anniversary of the American Revolution, the 200th anniversary that we're celebrating now across the country, of which the American Friends of Lafayette have done such an incredible job with Chuck leading the way. Chateau Lagrange, which is begun in the 14th century, actually owned by his wife's family. His wife predeceases Lafayette, but prior to her passing, they are able to take repossession of this castle that they had lost during the French Revolution. Lafayette is quite ill, and he is moved from this castle into the city of Paris, where he would eventually pass away. He's buried with his wife in the cemetery that she had some jurisdiction over, because during the Reign of Terror, at least her mother and sister were executed and interred in that cemetery. Kind of touching when he and his son George Washington Lafayette were here at the dedication of the obelisk at the Battle of Bunker's Hill. Lafayette's son would take a metal can, fill it with soil, and sprinkle it on Lafayette's grave when he is interred at Picpus Cemetery in Paris to be forever in American soil. An incredible story. And back to our original image. Kathy, I think we've used all of our time up. Questions?
Jeff will be entertaining questions presented by our DAR region, Debbie Thompson. Debbie.
Good evening, everyone. We have one question tonight from Juliet, and she says, on the painting of Lafayette in Mount Vernon, Lafayette is painted in a way that he looks very much like Washington. Is there a deliberate connection? Thanks.
Well, depending on what painting of Washington you're looking at, so a couple of things. It could be that they're both in their Continental Army uniforms, right? The blue and the buff. Actually, those colors, Washington joins an association in Fairfax County before the war begins. They've adopted as their colors the colors of the Whig Party in England. You got to remember, we're all British, right? David Hackett Fisher makes the point. Paul Revere was not yelling the British are coming because everybody was British, right? So they're wearing the same. Lafayette would adopt. He would want to wear what Washington would wear, the blue and the buff uniform, which Washington took from the Fairfax Associators into the Continental Army. So it's the same uniform. And that painting and most of Washington's paintings in uniform were done by the same artist. So there are those little connections that have them looking similar. We talked about the wigless portrait of Lafayette, and footnote, Washington never wore a wig. He always wore his own hair. So in that case, Lafayette does not have that frilly kind of European style wig, and Washington never wore one. So great question now.
Okay. We have a question from Robert. I may have misheard you. Wasn't the soil sprinkled on his grave from Bunker Hill?
Yeah. What did I say?
I don't remember.
Correct me. You were listening, Deb?
I was listening, but I was also looking at things as they were coming up.
So on Lafayette's tour, as you'll know, and I think Daniel Webster gave the oration at the dedication of the obelisk at Bunkers Hill. And yes, if I misspoke, I apologize. It was there that George Washington Lafayette gathered up that soil and brought it back to France. Quick point on George Washington Lafayette too. George Washington Lafayette's kind of synonymous with his dad's tour as they came back here. George Washington Lafayette was sent here. His parents feared for his life during the Reign of Terror. So as a young boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old, he was sent here and lived here, the United States, and lived with the Washingtons, not only in the presidential mansion in the city of Philadelphia, but he was here when Washington retired from the presidency. And he rode in the former president's carriage from Philadelphia to Mount Vernon. He lived in the house at Mount Vernon. Only when he heard that his parents were going to be released from prison in France did he want to make haste and get back there. So he knew Washington also, but he and his father were never together with Washington prior to Washington's death. They knew him separately, but on the reunion tour, they both enter the old family tomb to visit Lafayette, quite literally laying over top of Washington's coffin, leaving the family tomb with tears in his eyes, takes George Washington Lafayette by the hand and walks him into the tomb. Great story. Thanks for the question.
Jen did say you did say Bunker Hill.
Well, the customer is always right, so I'm not here to disparage anyone.
Okay. All right. I have an anonymous attendee asking, how did Lafayette reconcile his anti-slavery views with Washington being a slave owner?
That's a phenomenal question. So I like to make the claim that outside of maybe John Lawrence, maybe Hamilton, not 100% sure, Lafayette had such childlike enthusiasm for everything in life. Washington would write later on to a friend, Lafayette has a side that's not difficult to assail. meaning he's so enthusiastic that he gets taken advantage by people. And he did during the American Revolution. Congress selected him to go on a kind of a fool's errand into Canada. He went to Washington and asked Washington what he thought. Washington said, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I got my own opinion, but I want you to find out on your own. And he did. And he came back and he said, you were 100% right. It was a fool's errand. Go back, Deb, go back to that question. I got off on a little tangent. Oh, the slavery issue.
Yes.
So it's often thought that Lafayette was probably the only individual that could challenge Washington to his face on the slavery issue. So this probably really came to a head in that 1784 visit, and it's really the last time the men see each other. But go back, and it's actually a letter that Lafayette College owns. It's the second letter that I use in the book. So the American Revolution ends in drips and drabs. It's kind of like the guys talked about coming back from Vietnam, 2 or 3 on a plane. Wasn't like the big victory parades at the end of World War II. Washington experiences the same thing. Soldiers are going home. Communication to and from Europe, 3 weeks over, 3 weeks back. In Paris, they negotiate this treaty. So it's a 2-year period from Yorktown, the final major battle of the war, until there's a definitive treaty. Washington gets a letter from Lafayette. The definitive, it's over, you won. Lafayette sends him that letter. I think he actually sends it from Spain. But the first paragraph, he says to Washington, it's over, you won. Had you been a Julius Caesar, we'd have nothing to celebrate, but you're not. Paragraph number 1. Paragraph 2. Now, my dear general, what are you going to do about your black population? Boom. Right between the eyes. Washington sends him a great letter back, and he says, your concern about my black population is evidence of the benevolence of your heart. However, my dear Marquis, we will reserve this conversation for when I see you next. So Washington's not going to commit in writing his true feelings about slavery to Lafayette. You wait, you come here, we'll visit, we'll have that conversation. And there's no doubt about the fact that they did.
Okay.
But the slavery issue is a phenomenal topic between Washington and Lafayette.
Okay. I have a question from Melissa. I'm a 5th grade student who is interested in the American Revolution. In addition to the books that you've written, what other resources might help me learn more about the Marquis de Lafayette?
Melissa, I asked the same question that you asked. And I live in close proximity to Lafayette College. Our older son is a Lafayette graduate. And I went to the then curator of special collections. And I said, I've written 2 books on Washington from different perspectives. And I want to do one from Lafayette. What is it that I need to know? And she suggested a series, I think, of 6 books on selected letters. I think it's entitled Lafayette in the American Revolution. So there's nothing like reading a first-person documents to get a feel for who that individual really is. And then there's, and we can always make a connection back. Gottschalk is would be the editor of the Lafayette letters, the 6 volumes. But then there's also a volume that is just letters between Washington and Lafayette. So it's a great way to actually open that page up and read what the man had to say on paper to whoever he happened to be writing to. And they write, Washington and Lafayette write a lot back and forth to each other. It's interesting. Melissa's question brings to mind when I did the research on the book, and it took about 3 years to actually start to piece it together. I found a very interesting phenomenon. When they were in camp together, they eat dinner together every night. So that July 31st meeting, Washington allegedly says 2 things to Lafayette. Thank you for volunteering for our cause. He's not getting paid. And would you join my immediate military family? So there's very talented younger secretaries and so forth that sit around and have dinner at night. Washington's the older man in the room, and they talk about world affairs and they talk about the war. And it's in those meetings where they're discussing things, so they're not writing letters to each other. So I have to go to other sources to find out what's going on between the two of them to write this book. It's when they're apart from each other that they write letters back and forth to each other. And that's the material that we need to piece the story together. So it's kind of almost when I know history tells me that they're going to be apart from each other for a couple of months, I start to get anxiety because I have to go to other sources and find out what it is that they're talking about. Or I should say, when they're together, I get anxiety because they're not writing letters. They're sharing their thoughts at dinner at night. Nobody's writing it down. So great question, but go to those books to find out Lafayette's true thoughts he's writing to others.
Okay. We have a letter, or we have a question here from Robert. What happened to George Washington Lafayette when he became an adult? Any general comments about descendants?
I know only through the American Friends of Lafayette that I think they group up in France, for Lafayette's birthday or whatever the case might be. They go to the cemetery. I don't quite know what happens to him after Lafayette, after his father passes, which I think is 1834. But I certainly know about him as a young man while he's here for a short period with the Washingtons. Then he goes back and he joins his parents, who had been in prison for a couple of years during the French Revolution. So I wish I could pass along more information on that, but unfortunately not. He does. So we know about him when he's a young man, 14 or 15 years old with the Washingtons, and then he's with his dad. What was the tour? I think 14 months, of which Levasseur, Lafayette's secretary, keeps notes on everything that they do here, of which George Washington Lafayette's included in that. So that short bit of time while he's living with the Washingtons, then as far as I know, I don't keep track of him, but then he comes back here with his dad, and that's you got to think that 14 months and him seeing his father being celebrated here in the country is pretty incredible as well. So I wish I could give more information, but unfortunately, no, I don't know all that much about him. That's a great question. It'll be interesting to see when he passes. But here's a guy that grew up with President Washington, lived in the presidential mansion. So good stuff.
Okay. Melissa wanted to say thank you. I appreciate your helpful guidance.
Pleasure. Get those books.
I have a question here from Richard. It said, did Lafayette actually toast Washington in York, PA, that helped quell the conspiracy?
Go read that again, Deb. I'm sorry. Did Lafayette do what?
Did Lafayette actually toast Washington in York, PA, that helped quell the conspiracy?
Yep. So Lafayette is an unabashed Washington fan. And when they were at dinner, and if I'm not mistaken, the general that they wanted to replace Washington with may have been at that dinner. And Lafayette, the talk is that you can hear a pin drop when Lafayette makes his toast to Washington, because Washington was pretty much on the outs with the people that would have been in that room. So he said in his letter that I will defend you with the sword and or by any other means. So Lafayette's starting to catch on that there are not always good people on the same side. Washington ultimately hangs in there, and we know what they say, that's history, right? But that's the story anyway, that he toasts Washington, and just the room is absolutely silent. So he stood up for him.
Okay. I have a question from Jen. She said it's a two-part question. What does his family and wife call him? Or wait a minute. What does his family and wife's family call Lafayette? Did they call him Gilbert or Gilbert? And why did he have such a long name?
You know what? I can't answer either one of those questions. I'm not sure what his wife called him, but again, as I mentioned earlier, he calls her Deerheart, right? But I'm not. That's a good question. That's something that we should try to find out. Again, my research is almost all Washington and Lafayette related. I know what they called each other, so on and so forth. But two very good questions. Maybe we don't want to know what his wife called him. Right?
Jen said, "Thank you."
I wish I could be more specific, but supposedly, how do we talk about this and not step on toes? Lafayette, a very wealthy Frenchman, has got several relationships going on throughout the course of his life. So we went to an American Friends of Lafayette dinner, and there was, I don't think it was Mark Schneider, but it was a Lafayette impersonator did a great job. Lafayette would write home to a friend and ask, tell the quote unquote, tell the little one I was asking for her. So when the Lafayette impersonator goes by, I whispered in his ear, I said, how's the little one? And he said, sir, you've been reading my personal correspondence, which I thought was very quick, with a smile on his face. So at any rate.
All right. Jeff, what actually inspired you to write the book on the Marquis and George Washington?
Again, we were able to acquire that letter where Lafayette writes, August of 1784, I'm on my way to see you. And I thought, I got two books under this this heading, and this is the other two people that tell the story. Billy Lee, his enslaved valet, and Dr. Craik are not necessarily household names in history. This is a monumental relationship between these two men, and two worlds come together. Lafayette, with the connection to Versailles, Lafayette actually then turns out to be a very proficient battlefield commander. His first, Nathaniel Greene gives him the go-ahead to attack in what is now Mount Holly, New Jersey. Prior to the Valley Forge encampment, he actually leads a group of soldiers out of Valley Forge on kind of a reconnaissance mission. General Howe in the city of Philadelphia is so sure that he's going to be able to capture Lafayette before he leaves Philly. He sends dinner invitations out, and the guest at dinner that night is going to be the recently captured Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette does an amazing retreat, orderly retreat. Most military people say there's no such thing, but as it's described, an orderly retreat. He's almost captured to the point where Washington and his family come out to greet him as he's making his way back with his men. So not only his love for Washington, but he's a decent military commander. So if you like military history, and he's really, in a large way, responsible for the Virginia campaign, which ultimately culminates in Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in the last major battle of the war. So it's just a great story. You got to remember, Washington never had any of his own children. Lafayette's father's killed during the French and Indian War. The war that Washington begins, quite literally, gives the order to fire shots, beginning the first recorded World War. At age 2, Lafayette's father, ironically, is killed in the war that George Washington begins. The two men come together to kind of develop that father and son relationship. So just incredible ironies that history creates. And we thought it would be good to put that story in a book with Lafayette telling the story.
Okay. I just received another question from a Joni. She said, note, Lafayette was his title, not his name. He received the title at the death of his father at around the age of 2.
Yeah, so if you look at all those names and then it ends, comma, the Marquis de Lafayette. So we call him Lafayette. He's the Marquis of Lafayette. Like Cornwallis, for instance, the British commander, he's probably a Marquis also. They use the term on both sides of the British channel. He's the Marquis of Cornwallis. That's not really his name, right?
Okay. How can people purchase your books?
If you go to iknewgeorgewashington.com, you will find them there.
Okay.
So Billy Lee, Dr. Craig, the Marquis de Lafayette, and we did one for the ladies. I had George Washington's adopted granddaughter, Eleanor Nellie Bart Custis, tell our fourth story. She spends all 8 years of Washington's presidency living in the presidential mansion. So every day there's a knock at her door, and it's John Adams, it's Alexander Hamilton, and it's a guy by the name of Thomas Jefferson. That's the environment that she grows up in.
Okay. What was the greatest challenge in creating your book?
There's always challenges in not being a writer, sitting down with enough people that had success doing it. Barnes and Noble, maybe I shouldn't say that. At any rate, are we allowed to say that, Kath?
Yes.
We can strike that from the record. I had a good contact with them, and they were going to do the first book, but there was a little kind of political correctness that was seeping into the narrative. And I was told that if they buy your book, you have nothing to say about what the final art looks like. You have nothing to say about what the final manuscript reads like, so on and so forth. So I decided to do it on my own. So as a self-published author, you're a little bit of a black sheep. But I got very lucky when the research historian at Mount Vernon, who was also the resident expert on the enslaved community there, took an interest in my story and has edited all 4 of my books for historic accuracy. Mary Thompson. If anyone has an interest in Washington and slavery, probably the most comprehensive book is one that Mary did. She worked on it for 30 years, just published it in the past 5 or 6 years or so. So look up Mary, you'll find that book. It's absolutely incredible. So I did luck out by having her take an interest in my series and read through the manuscript and kind of square me up historically.
Okay. In closing, what message would you like to send about the Marquis de Lafayette?
Don't lose your childlike enthusiasm for life, which occasionally got him in a little bit of trouble, not terrible trouble, but he was referred to, and not in a good way, after his affiliation here between the American Revolution, the French Revolution. In between that period, he was referred to, and again, not in a good way, as the French Washington. So he wanted everything that he did. He would actually write letters back to Washington, and in the letter he would write, "I hope you approve of my conduct." So he forever sought Washington's approval, and I think that, as Washington referred to it, he has a side that's not difficult to assail. Stand up for what you believe in, never lose sight of it, and never lose your childlike enthusiasm. And if you have lost it, you can always get it back, which he did. Imprisoned after the American Revolution, he writes a letter to Washington: "I'm out of prison, and my dear general, I haven't changed a bit. I'm still that person that you knew when I was a young man." How incredible is that?
That is. I have one last thing here.
Please.
And Kim states, "Thanks for a great job. I hope you will come to Delaware to speak."
Deb, if I can I give a shameless plug? Am I allowed?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Go ahead.
I lecture all over the East Coast. I don't ask anything for doing it. I love the story. I love to tell the stories. I do DAR groups, SAR groups. I did a Questers group outside of Philadelphia the other day, a group of women who love history, schools, you name it, historic societies. I'm fortunate that I can move about and deliver my neat little stories to those that are interested in hearing it. So reach out to me at iknewgeorgewashington.com anytime. We'll show up. We'll take our little dog and pony show right to you.
And I have one last question, or it's actually a comment. This has been an extremely interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you for having me.
Jeff, what a fascinating perspective you provided on the relationship between Lafayette and George Washington. I mean, it was a sensational presentation, and I encourage everyone to check out your book, My Dear General. In addition to the website that Jeff just mentioned, it's also available on Amazon.
Amazon shopper, yes, they're out there.
Yes. Tonight's program with Jeff is available for later viewing on our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. We have enjoyed so much hosting Jeff and all of you this evening, and invite you to attend our next Marquis Monday, which takes place on Monday, March 3rd. And due to a slight schedule change, Jenny Coate will now present on May 5th, and our next featured Marquis Monday author will be Susan Joy, who has written the book Nantucket Cheese for Lafayette. Until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.